I didn't mean for things to get so out of hand.
We're here to help you, but you need to be honest with us.
You're gonna be okay. We're here to help you through this. Thank you. I need a moment.
There is a quiet, unspoken rule known well to those who have had to navigate spaces where they are merely tolerated, never truly welcomed. It is a weight carried in the backpack alongside textbooks and number 2 pencils. We call it the tax. For this young man, the tax was paid in the currency of absolute perfection. His morning did not begin with the casual, chaotic rush of his peers. It began with the ritual of armor. The white shirt, pressed until the cotton felt like starch and steel. The tie, knotted with a geometric precision that defied criticism. He checked the mirror not to admire a handsome face, but to inspect a defense strategy. His mother had taught him the doctrine of excellence early. She smoothed his collar with hands that had known the rough texture of worry for decades. She told him that to be safe, he had to be undeniable. He had to be twice as good to be considered half as worthy. And so, he wore his excellence like a shield. He walked through the hallways of the high school with a posture that screamed compliance. Eyes forward. Distinct, purposeful strides. No loitering. No loud laughter that could be misconstrued as aggression. To the casual observer, he was a model student, a beacon of promise. But to those of us who know the heavy cost of the tax, we see the exhaustion behind the eyes. It is a tiring business, constantly auditioning for one's own humanity. He entered the classroom, the site of the impending storm, and took his seat. Not in the back, where the shadows invite scrutiny, and not in the very front, where his presence might seem challenging. He chose the middle, the neutral ground. He laid out his notebook. He uncapped his pen. These were his weapons against suspicion. He arranged them with the care of a surgeon preparing for an operation, ensuring that no clutter could be mistaken for disorder. The room filled with the hum of adolescence, the restless energy of teenagers discovering the boundaries of the world. He did not join in. He could not afford the luxury of a mistake. If a paper ball was thrown, he did not throw it back. If a joke was cracked at the teacher's expense, he did not smile. He sat in a silo of silence, believing in the contract of the respectable. The contract states that if you follow every rule, if you are polite, if you are studious, and if you are quiet, the system will protect you. Or, at the very least, it will leave you alone. He believed that his behavior was a force field. He had calculated the variables. He had accounted for the bias. He had done the math of survival, carrying the one and leaving nothing to chance. But the air in the room began to shift. It was not a change in the weather, but a change in the density of the atmosphere. The door opened, not with the welcoming swing of an educator, but with the heavy, metallic thud of enforcement. The resource officer entered. The dynamic of the room did not just change, it evaporated. For most students, this was an interruption, a curiosity. For him, it was a signal that the contract was under review. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the involuntary stiffening of the spine. He checked his mental inventory. Was his phone away? Yes. Was his book open? Yes. Were his hands visible? Yes. He had paid the tax. He was paid up in full. Yet, as the heavy boots moved across the linoleum, echoing off the cinder-block walls, he realized with a creeping cold dread that the currency of excellence might have been devalued. The officer was not scanning the room for a troublemaker in the traditional sense. He was looking for a target. And sometimes, in the twisted logic of power, the quietest target is the most provoking. The silence he had cultivated as a defense was about to be misinterpreted as defiance. The perfection he wore as armor was about to be tested against a force that did not care about his grades, his pressed shirt, or his mother's prayers. The tension in the room coiled like a serpent, ready to strike, and he sat deadly still, waiting for a mercy that was nowhere to be found. To understand the profound tragedy of the seconds ticking away in that classroom, one must first understand the architecture of the young man sitting in the chair. He was not merely a student occupying a seat. He was a carefully constructed fortress of respectability. For 17 years, He had been raised on a strict diet of cautionary tales and heavy expectations. In his household, and in the households of so many who looked like him, excellence was not just a goal for the report card. Excellence was a survival strategy. It was a shield, forged in the fires of maternal anxiety and paternal instruction, designed to repel the very assumption of guilt that now stood over him. He believed, with the innocent certainty of youth, that if he followed every rule, crossed every T, and dotted every I, he would become untouchable. Look at his posture. Even in this moment of extreme duress, he does not slouch. His spine is straight, aligned against the hard plastic of the school chair. This is not accidental. This is muscle memory born of Sunday mornings and dinner table lectures. He was taught that his body was a public statement. To slouch was to invite disrespect. To look unkempt was to provide an excuse for authority to intervene. His clothes were immaculate, likely ironed by a mother who believed that a sharp crease in a pair of trousers could deflect the sharp edges of a prejudiced world. He wore his appearance like armor, a visible signal to the world that he was one of the good ones, the scholars, the future leaders. He was the exception that proved the rule, or so he had been told. In the silence of that room, his mind was likely running through his credentials like a desperate prayer. He was an honor roll student. He was a member of the debate team. He had never been in a fight. He had never been suspended. These were the bricks in the wall he had built around himself to keep this exact nightmare at bay. He had upheld his end of the social contract. He had done the work. He had been twice as good to get half as far, just as the old adage demanded. And because he had fulfilled his obligations so perfectly, he sat there frozen, unable to comprehend that the contract had been voided without his consent. He waited for the officer to recognize the mistake. He waited for the authority figure to see the honor student beneath the skin, to realize that this was a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a look at his transcript rather than a grasp of his wrist. But the defense of excellence is a fragile thing when faced with the blunt instrument of systemic force. The officer did not see the grades. He did not see the pressed shirt or the straight spine. He did not hear the mother's voice in the boy's head telling him to be polite, to be calm, to be still. The officer saw only a body that refused to move, a challenge to his command. The tragedy of this beat is the disconnect between two realities. In the boy's reality, his silence was a dignified protest, a reliance on his track record to speak for him when he could not speak for himself. In the officer's reality, that silence was a vacuum that needed to be filled with aggression. The boy sat still because he believed his innocence was self-evident, shining like a beacon that would ward off the darkness. He did not yet know that to some, his very presence was the offense, and his excellence was an affront that made him all the more necessary to break. There is a specific kind of silence that exists in the mind of a young man who has been taught that his survival depends on his comportment. It is not an empty silence, but a crowded one, filled with the echoes of kitchen table lectures and the stern, loving warnings of elders who remember a different time. As the officer's boots struck the linoleum floor, moving with a heavy, rhythmic thud toward the desk, the boy did not flinch. Instead, he reached for an internal dial, a mechanism he had been refining since he was old enough to understand the weight of his own skin. He began to turn the volume of the world down. The aggressive bark of authority, the collective gasp of his classmates, the squeak of chair legs dragging against the tile, all of it was muffled under a blanket of practiced stoicism. He retreated into the sanctuary of his own excellence, a mental fortress built from years of perfect attendance, honor roll certificates, and the unspoken promise that if he just followed the rules would protect him. This was the defense strategy he had been given, excellence as armor. He believed, with the naivety of the righteous, that his track record was visible on him like a glow. He thought the officer would see the open textbook, the neatly solved equations, the posture of a student who was there to learn, and realize a mistake had been made. In his mind, he was not a threat, he was a scholar. He was the pride of a grandmother who ironed his shirts on Sunday nights. He was the result of a father who taught him that a firm handshake and direct eye contact were the tools of a gentleman. As the officer's voice rose, turning from a command into a growl, the boy stiffened, not in defiance, but in a desperate attempt to hold his shape. He was applying the logic of the classroom to the chaos of the street. In math, 2 plus 2 always equals 4. In civics, compliance leads to de-escalation. But he was about to learn that, in the hallway of power, the math changes. The tragedy of this moment was not just the physical violence that loomed, but the shattering of a worldview. You could see it in his eyes, a flickering confusion behind the calm. He was waiting for the officer to recognize him. Not as a suspect, not as a quota, not as a problem to be removed, but as a citizen. He was waiting for His Excellence to speak for him. He sat anchored to his chair, his hands visible, his breathing controlled, waiting for the invisible shield of his good behavior to deflect the aggression coming his way. It was a heartbreaking wager. He was betting his dignity against a system that, in that moment, did not deal in the currency of dignity. The internal volume knob was turned so low that the officer's shouting sounded like it was coming from underwater. The boy focused on the grain of the wood on his desk, on the specific smell of graphite and old paper. He told himself that if he did not move, if he did not feed the fire, it would burn itself out. This is what he was taught. Be twice as good to get half as far. Be unimpeachable. Give them no reason. But as the shadow of the officer fell over him, blocking out the fluorescent overhead lights, the boy realized with a sinking dread that no reason was often reason enough. The armor of excellence was paper-thin against the blunt force of prejudice. He remained seated, a statue of rectitude, while the storm gathered force, preparing to tear him from the one place where he knew exactly who he was. To understand why he did not fight back, why he did not flail or scream as the hands of authority descended upon him, one must travel back from the fluorescent glare of the classroom to the golden, dust-mote silence of a Sunday afternoon 3 years prior. It was a lesson carved into him not in a school, but on a screened-in porch in late July, where the air hung heavy with the scent of cedar and old paper. The teacher was not certified by the state, but by survival. It was his grandfather, a man who possessed a dignity so formidable it seemed to physically displace the air around him. He was a man who wore a pressed three-piece suit to the grocery store, not out of vanity, but out of a tactical necessity born in a harder time. He understood what the boy was only just beginning to learn, that for them, excellence was not merely an aspiration. It was a shield. The boy remembered the texture of the wool as his grandfather adjusted his tie, the rough calluses on the old man's hands betraying a life of labor that the suit sought to conceal. He remembered the voice, gravelly and deep, instructing him on the architecture of survival. "You do not give them a reason," the old man had said, his eyes scanning a horizon only he could see. "You keep your back straight. You speak the king's English. You master their books better than they do. When you walk through this world, you are not just a boy. You are a representative. You are the evidence that we are more than they say we are." This was the burden of the intergenerational link. It was a heavy inheritance, this armor of excellence. It demanded that a 14-year-old boy possess the stoicism of a war veteran and the diplomatic grace of an ambassador just to attend a geometry lesson. The grandfather had taught him that his mind was a fortress. They might assault the walls, they might lay siege to the body, but if the mind remained disciplined, if the spirit remained unimpeachable, the citadel would not fall. Excellence was the defense against erasure. If you were perfect, the logic went, you were safe. It was a beautiful, terrible lie that the older generation told the younger to help them sleep at night, a talisman clutched against the dark reality of arbitrary power. So, when the officer's hand clamped onto his shoulder, heavy and trembling with an anger that belonged to a different narrative, the boy did not react as a frightened child. He reacted as a student of that Sunday porch. He retreated instantly into the fortress his grandfather had built for him. As the chair scraped violently against the linoleum, a sound that surely tore through the hearts of every other child in that room, the boy went limp. This was not surrender. It was the ultimate exercise of the discipline he had been taught. To thrash would be to give them the image they wanted, the savage, the threat, the justification for their force. To remain still, to remain silent, was to hold up a mirror to the brutality. It was an act of defiance so subtle it looked like passivity, but inside, the gears were grinding. He was reciting the lesson. Be twice as good. Be twice as calm. Let their violence slide off the armor of your rectitude. He felt the officer's grip tighten, the sheer indignity of being handled like luggage, but he kept his eyes fixed on a point in the distance, perhaps seeing that porch again. He was stripping the officer of his power by refusing to acknowledge the fear. The grandfather had said, "Dignity is the one thing they cannot take, you have to give it to them." And as he was hoisted from his seat, his legs dragging across the floor he had walked on that morning with a backpack full of dreams, he held onto that dignity with a grip of iron. He was not a criminal being apprehended. He was a young king being dethroned by a usurper, and he would not disgrace the lineage by screaming. The police report was written in the cold, jagged language of bureaucracy. It spoke of active resistance, of failure to comply, of a threat that needed to be neutralized. These are the words used to paint a picture of chaos, to justify the unjustifiable. They attempted to construct a narrative where the violence inflicted upon a child was a necessary procedure, a standard protocol for maintaining order. But there is another ledger kept in this life, one that cannot be altered by the heat of a moment or the bias of a badge. It is the ledger of a life lived with intention, the accumulated receipts of character that serve as a shield long after the physical wounds have healed. While the officer filed his paperwork, attempting to criminalize a moment of confusion, the community began to pull the true files. They did not find a rap sheet. They did not find a history of aggression or a pattern of disrespect. What they found was the armor this young man had been forging in the quiet hours of the library and the early mornings before the sun crested the horizon. They found a grade point average that sat near the pinnacle of his class. They found a robotics club membership, a seat in the church choir, and the glowing recommendations of teachers who knew him not as a suspect, but as a scholar. This is the pillar of excellence as defense. We often tell our children to keep their hands visible and their voices low, to survive the encounter. But there is a deeper instruction passed down through the generations, a strategy of counter-warfare fought with books and behavior. We tell them that they must be so undeniably excellent that the lie cannot stick. We tell them that their success is their safety, or at least, their vindication. This young man had listened. He had wrapped himself in the undeniable proof of his own potential. When the media began to dig, looking for a reason to blame the victim, looking for that one photo or that one rumor that would explain why a grown man felt the need to drag him like luggage, they hit a wall of immaculate reputation. The contrast was blinding. On one side, the brute force of authority, messy and unrestrained. On the other, the quiet dignity of a student who had done everything right. The Bodycam footage provided the visual shock, but his transcript provided the moral indictment. It revealed that the officer had not just assaulted a student, he had assaulted the future. He had laid hands on a valedictorian in the making, mistaking a prince for a pauper because he could not see past his own prejudice. This is the moral victory. It is a victory that tastes bitter, because no amount of honors classes should be required to purchase bodily autonomy. A child should be safe regardless of their grades. And yet, in the aftermath, his excellence became his loudest witness. It stood in the courtroom of public opinion and testified without saying a word. It stripped the incident of ambiguity. There was no both sides to this story. There was only the stark, terrifying reality of competence being punished by incompetence. The silence he maintained while being dragged was not just shock. It was the discipline of a mind trained to think 3 steps ahead, realizing that his composure would be the backdrop against which the officer's rage would look most grotesque. The news cycles have long since moved on, chasing fresh outrages and new headlines, but the image remains burned into our collective retina. It serves as the final lesson of this saga, one that requires no textbook to understand. We are left looking at a young man who understood something profound about the nature of power. True power is not the weapon on the hip or the badge on the chest. It is the unassailable fortress of the self. When the dust finally settled, the officer was left with nothing but his rage, a hollow thing that echoed in the emptiness of a ruined career. The student, however, walked away with something far more dangerous to the old order. He walked away with his dignity intact. For generations, grandfathers and grandmothers have whispered the hard truth to their kin. They have said you must be twice as good to get half as far. It is a weary maxim, heavy with the weight of historical injustice. Yet, in this classroom, we saw the evolution of that survival strategy. It was not just about being good enough to survive. It was about being so composed, so visibly superior in character, that the injustice became undeniable to even the most cynical observer. His silence was not submission. It was a mirror. And in that mirror, the officer, and indeed the entire system that empowered him, was forced to look at its own grotesque reflection. To look at this young man is to see the prayers of ancestors manifested in flesh and bone. He did not fight back with fists, which would have given them the excuse they craved. He fought back with a stillness that screamed. This is the sophistication of the modern struggle. It is a chess move played against an opponent who thinks they are in a boxing match. The officer swung wildly, exhausting himself, breaking his own reputation against the granite wall of the boy's calm. As we close this chapter, we realize that the dragging was not an end, but a beginning. The settlement, the public apology, the policy changes, these are merely paperwork. The real victory is internal. This young man goes on to universities, to boardrooms, to a life of consequence. He carries the knowledge that he survived the fire without smelling of smoke. He proved that excellence is the ultimate defense, the one weapon they cannot confiscate, the one shield they cannot break. The officer will be remembered for what he did to a child. The child will be remembered for who he became despite the officer. That is the final justice. It is slow. It is quiet. But it is absolute.